Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, and business. This week, Scott McCartney discusses his book, ENIAC, The Triumphs and Tragedies of the World's First Computer.
Scott McCartney, author of ENIAC, The Triumphs and Tragedies of the World's First Computer. Why'd you write the book?
I was covering the technology industry for the Wall Street Journal, and it occurred to me that I didn't know who invented the computer, and that struck me as very strange. I was covering personal computer industry, Compaq, Dell, IBM, and really was not as aware of the origins as I should have been. And that sort of coincided with the 50th anniversary of ENIAC here at the University of Pennsylvania. So as I learned more about ENIAC, I realized there was a pretty incredible story to tell there, and that just kept getting deeper and deeper into it.
How much did you know about computers before you started?
Well, you know, I knew a fair amount about personal computers. I didn't know a whole lot about the origins of the computer or mainframe. I'm of an age where the computer for me was very much transitional. I went to college without a computer, but I installed the first computer system at our campus newspaper. So it was, you know, it was all happening, and I thought, you know, here we were on the pioneering edge, and it hadn't occurred to me that so much had happened 40 years earlier.
Why is that it's not known?
I think things have changed so rapidly that there hasn't been time to go back and sort of assess the roots of it all. We have enough trouble keeping up with, you know, one innovation after another, and the PC has just exploded on the scene. I think computers 40 and 50 years ago were, you know, they were inaccessible to most people, and were a bit mysterious and not very well known. Although some of them did sort of have their own personality and became famous in their own right. But you know, I think another reason why I wanted to do the book was it seemed like a very good time to take a step back in the history of technology and look at a lot of these questions of who invented the first computer and how did it evolve. And you know, we have a much better sense today of what a computer is and what are the defining characteristics that have made so much change. And so with that advantage of hindsight, it was a good time to go back and explore the roots.
What was that first computer that you installed at the newspaper?
It was a very rudimentary, essentially a mini mainframe system built by a company out in, Nebraska or so. And we had dumb terminals in different departments at the newspaper and a central storage disk and controller. And we were able to write stories and transmit them to the central controller, and from there send them across the university campus to the place where things were typeset. And it was revolutionary. I mean, it was, you know, when I went to college in 1978, we were still typing out on paper and cutting and pasting and literally carrying the copy over to the comp shop where it would be typeset. And this was a great savings, but you know, the thing was slow and it was always going down and had minuscule memory, and you know, it's really pretty amazing.
Were you the guy they looked to every time it had a problem?
Oh yeah, middle of the night calls, and you know, what do we do with this? What do we do with that? But you know, we were college kids, and people picked it up pretty quick.
How much did you have to learn about the technology in order to write this book?
A fair amount. I was. My knowledge of vacuum tubes at the time was limited to brief memories of the RCA repairman coming with a little dolly full of vacuum tubes to fix our color television in the living room. I didn't know much about that at all, and certainly not about the logical design of computers. Or I'm not an engineer by training, and there was a great deal of engineering that went into this.
Now, we are sitting here at the ENIAC Museum at the University of Pennsylvania. Why is this museum here?
This museum's here because this was the birthplace. We're in the building where the first modern computer was built on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. The ENIAC, in the basement of this building, it's a fascinating history. In the basement of this building, there was a machine called a Bush differential analyzer, which was a big, long contraption of gears and wheels and rods, and you would do differential equations by setting different gears to different values and actually cranking the problem through this thing. The Army at the start of before the start of World War II was in desperate need of computational power. What they needed was something that would calculate trajectories for artillery shells. This work was being done down the road in Aberdeen, Maryland, and they came to the University of Pennsylvania because they had this machine in the basement, the Bush differential analyzer, and got them to help do it. Penn had a staff of women, many of them mathematicians, who were actually doing the work down there. They were also using Monroe desk calculators, which were essentially good old adding machines with an arm you would pull back, and using those to do the computations. As war drew nearer and nearer, professors were called off to war, and the Army was in desperate need for electrical engineering help. There was a physicist named John Mauchly who had gone to Johns Hopkins and was actually teaching over at a little college called Ursinus College. And
Collegetown, Pennsylvania.
Collegetown, Pennsylvania, exactly. Mauchly wanted to predict the weather using computations, and that was his dream. And he bought during the Depression, he had bought his own Monroe desk calculator on the cheap from a bank that failed, and he was doing all this stuff. He had his students running computations on weather patterns and things, but it was never enough. He never had enough computing power to solve his weather problems. So he ended up enrolling here at Penn in a course that the Army was offering to train people in electronics, because the Army needed people for radar and different, new areas of electronics that were going to be vital to World War II. Mauchly just wanted to get the knowledge of electronics. He wasn't real interested in helping out the Army. But he ended up being paired with a graduate, or a soon-to-be graduate student here at the university who had just completed his undergraduate degree, a fellow named Presper Eckert, who had grown up here in suburban Philadelphia and was a brilliant engineering whiz. And they got over across the street at an ice cream shop. They would start talking about Mauchly's dream of, couldn't we build a computer? And Mauchly actually produced a paper for the faculty here. He was hired on after the course because Penn needed, desperate need of faculty people. And Eckert thought that Mauchly was onto something and that they could actually build this machine. The first proposal for what's the modern computer was I think, pretty conclusively shown, was thrown away by the faculty here at Penn. But Mauchly got, one of the Army fellows heard about the proposal and tracked down Mauchly, and they recreated the proposal, ended up taking it to the Army, and that was the birth of the ENIAC project.
You described Mauchly as a dreamer.
Yeah, very much so. Mauchly was worldly wise and would carry on these wonderful conversations about all kinds of things. I mean, people remember him leading discussions about Alice in Wonderland, and as a professor over at Ursinus, he became famous for what was called a Christmas lecture, kind of the end of the semester, where he would dress up as a Russian roller skater to demonstrate the laws of physics or things like that. But he, all of his life, even very late in his life, he always had huge dreams and was always sort of too far ahead of his time to be successful in a practical sense. If he hadn't had the big dream, I don't think this would have ever happened.
And Presper Eckert?
Yeah, Eckert was...
what kind of a name is Presper?
It was a family name. I think it was actually his grandmother's maiden name.
And he is, you describe as a true Philadelphia blue blood.
Right. He went to Penn Charter School and...
was taken there by a chauffeur every day.
Driven there by a chauffeur, lived near Connie Mack, and his father was a fairly prominent developer, and they would, there's even a picture of Press on with Douglas Fairbanks, and Press on a golfing outing with President Harding, and the Eckerts were quite prominent. And Press was an amazing kid. He, at a very young age, won a science fair here in Philadelphia by putting together what essentially was an amusement he saw in Paris of boats on a lake. And Press figured out a way to put a magnet in the bottom of the boat, and then through electricity pull the magnets around, and you could steer the boats by using this electromechanical thing that he built, won the science fair. He did very well at Penn Charter and was going to go off to MIT, but his mom didn't really want him to leave home, so he ended up here at Penn.
Hey, you write in the book, you tell a story about he always had a white linen shirt with a monogram and a black necktie. Always recalled one of the women, Kathy Mauchly Antonelli, who later became Mauchly's second wife. I asked him why once, and he said, "This is what my mother put out for me this morning." He lived a very pampered life.
Yes.
So he lived a pampered life, and yet he seemed driven by this project or by things that he got involved in.
He would be fanatical about a project. I mean, the people told me stories about Press. He would get so wound up in a project that he would get up and walk out the building and never know that he had left the building. He had his wife would ask him to go downtown to look at furniture, and he would say okay, but he would drag somebody from the project along, and they would carry on a conversation about some sort of problem the entire time while he would look at furniture with his wife. He had this he had a pocket watch chain without a watch, and you could always tell when Press was getting really wound up because he would just twirl the chain around his finger and untwirl it and twirl it and untwirl it. And
I'll read you this other thing. You say you describe him as a whirlwind of quick, nervous energy, and one of his coworkers said he had a fiery temper that could make grown men speechless. There wasn't a single one of the staff that he didn't tell him where to solder the joint. Some mornings he came in and told engineers to tear up what they had done because he had thought of a better idea overnight. So he sounds like he was kind of difficult to work for.
he was. In a sense, people loved working for him because he was so brilliant and because he was so driven. But on the other hand, he was not one to hand out praise, and he was incredibly demanding, and the hours were just, around the clock, manic. There was a great story about a fellow who went for a job interview with Press, and he would show him his engineering drawings, and Press would sit there, and he would go on for 15 or 20 minutes about other things that the guy could have done with his drawings, and then say, okay, show me the next one. And the interview was never about the engineer he was going to hire. It was all about, Press's fascination with anything mechanical.
Now, how did driven Press Eckley and dreamer John
Eckert and John
Mauchly, how'd they get along?
They got along great because they complemented each other so well. And I think one of the fundamental things of this team was that they understood their own shortcomings, and they understood that they needed each other. It was fascinating to me that they were very different personalities, and yet they had very similar childhoods. Mauchly was much more middle class. His father was a scientist, but when he was at a young age, he loved to read at night, and his parents would get mad at him for leaving the light on too late. So he wired a sensor under a stair. This is when he's about 10 or 12 years old, so that when his parents would come up the stairs to check on him at night to make sure his light was out, they would step on this loose board on the stairs, and that would trigger a sensor, and you turn out the light, and parents would go up a couple steps, and yes, the light's out, and they come back down, and that would trigger the sensor again and give him the all clear. And Eckert was doing the same things. He was wiring up intercom systems for his father's apartment buildings, and put a sound system into a crematorium at one of the local cemeteries here to sort of provide soothing sounds throughout the grounds. And so they had similar fascinations, but they were so different. Eckert knew he needed Mauchly for the logic, for the big picture, for the motivating dreams. And Mauchly knew he was never going to get anything built unless he had Eckert to build it.
What's an osculometer?
An osculometer is an invention that Presper Eckert came up with for a dance here at the university, where the legend was that if a couple held hands and with these paddles from the osculometer and kissed, the machine would measure the intensity of the kiss. And there was a whole scale of light bulbs, and it would go, all the way up. And if you were really good, the machine would go, wow, wow, wow. And what the engineers knew, and their dates didn't know, was that if you got your hands kind of sweaty, and you could make an electric circuit with the sweaty palms and the paddles and your date's hands and the lips, and it was really all a function of how wet you got your hands that would make it go. And that's, Eckert had a wonderful sense of humor, and he would do things like that from time to time that really endeared himself to people.
So when Eckert and Mauchly got together and they decided, okay, they're getting the funding from the Army, we're going to build this computing machine, how much did they know beforehand that made them think it would work?
They were really taking a leap of faith. They thought it would work, but they didn't really know. And many, many eminent scientists of the day said there was no way that it would ever work. The basic problem was that behind these panels here are hundreds of vacuum tubes, and there were 40 units in the machine, 18,000 vacuum tubes, and vacuum tubes are notoriously unreliable. They were always breaking down. And so if you had 18,000 of them, what are the odds that the machine would ever work for any length of time without one tube or another breaking down? And one tube could destroy your whole computation. So MIT and others looked at this plan and said, this will never work. Eckert really thought that he could engineer enough control into it and enough, he was just a nut about quality control, that he could design it so that it would work. He tested every tube he could possibly find and ended up using tubes in ENIAC that were used for undersea telephone cables. And he ran them, if they were built for a certain voltage, he ran them at a much lower voltage to prolong their life. He only used them as on-off switches rather than amplitude, it didn't have to be as accurate. You didn't care how much voltage was actually inside the tube. It was just an on-off switch to Eckert. He even went as far as he took every brand of wire he could possibly find and put samples in a cage with rats. And whichever brand of wire was least appetizing, that's what he used in ENIAC to minimize rat damage.
How much wire did he need for the computer?
There were several miles of wire. I mean, it's just enormous. The machine filled 1,800 square feet, about the size of, a pretty good sized apartment. And it was through that quality control that Eckert produced a machine that in fact did work and could run for long periods of time without a tube breaking. Another thing he did, this is in 1944 and 45, just amazing. It's a complete modular design. The tubes were mounted on what he called trays, and if a tube failed, you just pop out the tray and pop in a spare tray, and you were back in business in no time at all. And so it was through that engineering skill that he really made it happen.
You talk about vacuum tubes, and this is a tube, and it turns out that the two people running camera here are on the young side, and they don't remember tubes in radios and television. So for those people, can you tell me what this is and what it did or does?
Sure. A vacuum tube, essentially the simple ones had three elements. There would be an emitter of electrons and a collector and a grid that would control the voltage. They were used most often for telephone and radio and television as amplifiers. You could control the current of electricity very well with the vacuum tube. So that's how you get the modulation in old-time radio or in early television. Those things were filled with vacuum tubes. In ENIAC, they were essentially used as an on-off switch, very much like a light switch. And Eckert designed a thing with, at its core, two tubes together called a flip-flop. And when one tube was on, that was the normal state, and when it was off, that was the abnormal state. And you needed two because it would toggle back and forth. And that's how he was able to represent numbers with these on-off switches. That if you look up the accumulators, there's 0 through 9, and each of those numbers corresponds to a couple vacuum tubes. Depending on the state of those tubes, that's how the information was stored in the computer.
Now, this is the world's first digital computer, and can you describe for people who don't understand what digital means, just what it means that it's digital?
Well, there's analog and there's digital. Analog would be like the speedometer on your car. It's an approximation. It's a needle showing certain values. It moves in a wave. Digital is a very discrete value. It's like the odometer on your car, where it rolls over to 20 miles or 20.1 miles or whatever. Analog, by its nature, is not as accurate as digital. Computers up until ENIAC were essentially, computers, they weren't really modern computers, but the computing machines of the day were analog, where, like the Bush differential analyzer downstairs, where the gears and wheels and numbers would be represented by a place on a wheel, and it would turn. And if things got worn down or out of alignment or whatever, it could affect the value. And you kind of look at that wheel and say, it looks like 8. That would be the value. Digital it has to be 8 or it has to be 7, but there's a specific thing that tells you whether it's 8 or 7. So digital is much more accurate. The other great advantage is it's in a computer where digital goes with electronic. It's much, much, much faster. And speed was really the whole, speed was everything. I mean, even then, the PC, Intel is constantly cranking out faster and faster chips. It was the same for Eckert and Mauchly. The thing that John Mauchly needed to do his weather computations was speed. And the whole reason he went to a digital machine and an all-electronic machine was that he knew that was the only way to get the speed to do the size of calculations that he wanted to do.
Now, you said that speed was even then an issue, and now every couple months a new computer comes along that's vastly faster. Is there a limit to that? I mean, why the emphasis on speed?
Well, the faster the machine can calculate, the more you can calculate, the more you can do. If you have an enormously complicated problem and a slow computer, as it churns through and gets different values and has to go back and do this, I mean, you may never get to the end of the problem. And particularly with machines of this era, if it was a big, long problem, the machine's going to break down. Even the analog mechanical ones would break down before you'd ever get to the problem. So you couldn't put on, there was a limit to the complexity of the problem that you could do with the machine. And even today, it's the speed of the computer that allows us to do more and more things with the internet. You couldn't download graphical websites unless you had a very fast computer. The faster your computer, the faster it'll flash up the information from that website. or the more complex problems you can run on your PC. Or if you're in the supercomputer realm, you know, the faster it is, the more finely you can run your calculations on, say, nuclear explosions or something like that.
And when they were building this computer with, was it 5,000 tubes?
18,000 tubes eventually, right.
Did they have cooling, or did it just
very much,
get hot?
yeah. Well, the tubes have a heater in them because they have to be hot to give off electrons. And so the tubes generate enormous, 18,000 of them generates enormous heat. So in the bottom there were blowers and fans and cooling system that would try and blow up through the machine and blow the heat out the top of it.
How many people were on the team that put it together?
There were about a dozen people in sort of the hardcore of the team. They brought in 6 women to do the programming on it.
Did they call it programming then?
They did, yeah, actually. And one of the interesting things is the women themselves were called computers. The people who were downstairs doing the calculations and all, they were called computers. The term computer didn't really apply to a machine. They called them calculators and calculating machines and things like that. And that term got transferred from the women to the machine.
How did they know as they were in the process of building it that they were on the right track?
Early on, they got 2 accumulators together, and Eckert and Mauchly wanted it to multiply 5 times 1,000. And they called some of the women in and loaded 5 into one accumulator and 1,000 into the other and said, you know, multiply the 2 together and store the product in one of the accumulators. And lo and behold, it said 5,000. And they went nuts. They were ecstatic. And some of the women looked at them and said, so, you know, you need a computer to multiply 5 times 1,000. But for them, it you know, was verification that the thing was actually going to work.
When was it finished?
Was finished in the fall of 1945 after the war was over. It wasn't much help for the war effort at the time. It was dedicated in February of 1946 at a public unveiling here in Philadelphia.
What did they have it do? What was it capable of doing?
Gosh, it was one of the great things about ENIAC was it's a general purpose machine. And it was capable of doing all kinds of things. The main reason for that was the Army wanted a machine to calculate differential equations for the artillery shells, the trajectory. And it could do that, but Mauchly wanted his weather computer. So they designed it to be general purpose, to do both. The Army used it for years and years to, in fact, do artillery shell calculations and all, but also to do all kinds of things like run calculations for nuclear weapons programs. In fact, one of the very first problem, the shakedown cruise for the machine, was a problem that came from Los Alamos. Edward Teller and some other folks from Los Alamos were trying to design the first hydrogen bomb. And they thought they were on the right track. They came to Philadelphia to put the problem on ENIAC, and ENIAC told them that they were wrong and showed them that they were wrong. And Teller said, okay, I understand that, but so now I know how to do it because that's wrong. That points me in the right direction. And they, you know, obviously did solve the problem. But ENIAC, I mean, the Army used it for 8 years. At one point, some folks told me they were calculating weather patterns in Russia. I said, well, why are you calculating weather patterns in Russia? Well, for nuclear fallout. The Army wanted to know where the nuclear fallout would go at different times, things like that.
When all was said and done, how much did it cost?
About $500,000, which was a lot of money in 1945 during the war effort. It was, you know, there was a great leap of faith here. I mean, it would have, in many ways, never have happened if not for the war. That was a lot of money to sink into John Mauchly's pipe dream. And the Army was desperate. I think there was also a feeling that big scientific projects could yield a result. I mean, the Manhattan Project, which preceded this by a little bit, was you know, very much a leap of faith, a more expensive, more challenging leap of faith in some ways. But It was sort of the same idea. Okay, let's, it's wartime, let's take a chance.
Was there somebody in the Army who bought into it and was the chief person in the Army who got them to
Yes,
embrace it?
very much. There was, the main guy was a lieutenant named Herman Goldstein, and he was put in charge of the ballistic, the artillery shell calculations at Aberdeen. And he was a PhD mathematician himself, and he was the one that shepherded Mauchly's proposal through the Army and convinced the Army that it could work, and then was very much instrumental in getting the project built here. Was involved in, some of the design issues. Was involved in procuring all the. This is made out of steel, which was in short supply during the war, and this is made out of there's, the tubes and the wiring, and all that was difficult to come by, and Goldstein had an enormous role in that. He was, in some ways, he was a great counterbalance to Eckert and Mauchly because, he kept them on schedule, kept them on track, moving ahead, and spent, hours and hours was with them constantly.
Did the Army think they got their money's worth?
Oh yeah, I think very much so. And the Army is quite proud that it was the organization that funded the start of the computer age. But the Army used this thing for 8 years. If you look at how long computers last today, that was a pretty good deal.
Can I ask you a little bit about yourself? Where are you from originally?
From Boston originally. Grew up in suburban Boston.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to Duke University, North Carolina.
Studying?
Public policy. I spent much of my college time working on the college newspaper. We had a great little, totally student-run daily newspaper. We competed with the local paper in Durham and produced a lot of journalists out of that.
What does someone who studied public policy want to be when he grows up? Lawyer, journalist, politician. Public policy was a wonderful program started by Terry Sanford, who was governor of North Carolina and ran for president, and just a wonderful, wonderful man. Was president of Duke when I was there. I got to know him very well. And Terry wanted to educate leaders. That was his main thing. And public policy was a great hodgepodge of economics and history and political science and even religion, and a lot of it was a cross-disciplinary field that to me was a great liberal arts education. Now, of the many paths you could have followed, which one did you follow?
I went to college thinking I was going to be a doctor and came out realizing that I could probably make a living as a journalist, and so that's what I did. I went to work for the Associated Press, the wire service, and spent 11 years there, and then went to work for the Wall Street Journal.
You work in New York now?
Actually, I'm based in Dallas. We have a pretty good-sized bureau in Dallas, and I've spent my career working for New York organizations, but all in Texas.
So you wrote this book in your spare time while you were holding down a full-time job?
Well, I took 2 different leaves of absence to get it done, but it was over a 3-year period. It was a lot of weekends and vacations and things like that. It became a real labor of love. It just, the more layers of the story you peeled back, the more interesting it got, and I sort of felt a little bit like Eckert. I'd get, manic, and I had some wonderful reporting experiences in Washington at the Smithsonian and at the Library of Congress, and I'd call my wife and say, "You're not going to believe what I found today, and this is incredible." And so it was a blast.
You meet any interesting people while you wrote this book?
Yeah, I mean the Herman Goldstein was just a terrific fellow. Spent some time with him. The widows of Eckert and Mauchly, both of whom live here in the Philadelphia area, were just wonderful. We had some wonderful days, and they let me go up into their attics and explore through papers. And Judy Eckert has, presses science fair projects and his first patent, and just, wonderful stuff. And then some of the, the veterans who had worked on ENIAC, the women who were the first programmers were just delightful, and it was a wonderful experience.
Now, Mauchly died in 1980, and
1980,
Eckert in
right.
1990. What was it?
It was 1995, right before the 50th anniversary.
So you didn't get to interview
No,
Eckert for this?
no, that's my one great regret. One of Mauchly's friends had sat him down near the end of his life in front of a video camera and did about 17 hours, I think, of videotape. And so I sat and watched that, and it was like being in John Mauchly's classroom. I mean, he would just lecture and tell wonderful stories, and was just a captivating teacher. And you go through that experience, and I really felt like, between that and his family and all, I was really getting to know him, and hearing the stories about Eckert, and rummaging through his house and seeing how he lived and all. I felt like I got to know these guys. My one great regret is, they've been forgotten, and they shouldn't have been. And these are the guys who built the first modern computer and founded the first computer company and never really made much of money from it, and ended up losing credit for a lot of what they did to people with bigger reputations and all. And there's a great injustice here. And that was a lot of the motivation for me in doing the story. And one of the great regrets is that they're not alive to see, history come back around on them.
Why did they get forgotten?
I think, some of it was a little bit of their own fault, and a little bit they got steamrolled by a lot of people. They left the university under great controversy, and set out on their own, and their company ultimately, they built UNIVAC, the first commercially successful computer, but their company really struggled. They were underfunded. By the time UNIVAC became famous, it was part of Sperry Rand and became Sperry. UNIVAC is today what's part of the Unisys Corporation out in Bluebell here. And so, in a way, it was their lack of business success themselves kept them, they weren't Bill Gates or Michael Dell, or, the business people today become heroes in their own right. It wasn't to be for Eckert and Mauchly. There were some very nasty fights over the patent on the ENIAC, essentially the patent on the computer. They ended up basically victims in a drive-by shooting on that. And so for, a host of, a lot of pretty incredible circumstances, they ended up, left out by the wayside.
Are there people who would read your book and say, wait a minute, that's not the way it happened. They weren't the people who built the first computer. Is that controversial?
Well, what's controversial is what you define as the first computer. The Brits tell you that they invented the first computer because they built the first machine with a internal stored program. They have to have a stored program memory to be a computer. I don't think that's right. Most people don't think that's right. Besides, ENIAC had the capability to internally store some programming. It wasn't a stored program concept computer. The irony of the Brits' claim is that they built it off blueprints that they got here at the University of Pennsylvania and happened to get their machine done before the computer here at Penn, because Eckert and Mauchly had left and the project here sort of fell apart and all that. Some of the Germans like to say Konrad Zuse invented the first computer. His machines were electromechanical. They were not all electronic. There were still some analog aspects to them. There were machines like that built in this country at Harvard, and Bell Labs and places like that. But to me, a computer has to be digital. It has to be programmable. It has to be general purpose, because that's one of the defining characteristics of what we today know as a computer. And it has to be powerful. And if you take all that into consideration, then ENIAC is clearly the first. There's another controversy over whether Mauchly was influenced by a fellow in Iowa named John Atanasoff. And that's ultimately what led to the ENIAC patent was invalidated in the 1970s. And that's an incredible, fascinating tale in its own right, which became an important part of the book. But I think it's ludicrous to say that Atanasoff's machine, which never worked really, it's silly to call that the first computer.
Now, sitting in front of this, how much of the computer is still here in the museum? This is a wall full here, but
yeah,
what does it constitute?
well, this is 4 units. There were 40 in the whole computer, so this is 1/10 of the machine, and the machine itself was laid out in a U. There were panels up, and then on the end, and then panels back down. It was all symmetrical, and this was. This would sort of be near the start of the machine. This was a unit called a function table where you could turn these dials and set them for different values. Say you were doing an artillery shell calculation and you wanted to set the wind speed at 10 knots or something like that. You would do that with this kind of thing. And then there's what's called a cycling unit where that would generate the pulses that would run through the machines. Down here are the digit trays, which was the wiring that carried the pulses through the machine. The really monumental thing about ENIAC was that it was the first machine to use electricity to represent numbers. And when you can do that, then you can get incredible speed. But essentially using, and this was one of the concepts that fascinated me working on the book was the whole notion of using electricity to think. And how did that come to be? And it's something we certainly take for granted now, but it seemed kind of foreign. I mean, electricity, lights things and it drives things and all, but it's not intelligence, it's not knowledge. So how do we get the waves to be intelligence? And so the waves would come out of the cycling unit. And this was this was accumulator number 18 up there. It says there were 20 accumulators, and those could store 10-digit numbers. And you would move numbers around from accumulator to accumulator, use them to add. You could put a little bit of programming into the accumulator and do different things like that. And then the last unit there is one of the master programmers. And that was where you could literally set up the program, both with switches and with some information that you would give it electronically.
Last element there is that over your shoulder there. What is that, and what does it do?
This is a portable function table, and this would you would set up your problem and use this to represent all kinds of different constant functions. I mentioned wind speed, or a lot of different things for the artillery shell, humidity, temperature of the gunpowder. I mean, you're producing a lot of different things, and this is on wheels, and you could take this thing and literally wheel it around to different points in the machine and plug it in. On the end, there's a big plug, and it would plug into a receptacle like that.
Sort of like a big floppy disk.
Well, yeah, actually, this is the equivalent of read-only memory. I mean, this is, once you set these values, they're set. But you need those kind of values in the computer. Now, you can do different variables with the electronic components, but this was, you would physically set those switches. And it's crude, but it's ingenious. I mean, you put the thing on wheels and literally wheel it around, and that's part of your programming. You figure out where to plug this thing in. It was really clever what they did.
Now, your book refers to ENIAC as the world's first computer, but here at the ENIAC Museum at the University of Pennsylvania, at the top up there, it describes it as the world's first electronic, large-scale, general-purpose digital computer. Why all the qualifying words?
Because of the controversy, because of competing claims, because the university didn't want to offend anybody. I use the term modern. ENIAC is the first modern computer, and that's what I was trying to say. What is a modern computer? I mean, we're 50 years into it. I think we can now decide what the crucial elements of a computer are. And you know, a computer has to be digital. It has to be general purpose. One of the beautiful things about the computer is you can use it to run spreadsheets, or you can use it to do word processing, or you can use it to do graphics from the internet, or all kinds of different things. If you had to have a separate machine for each of those functions, it wouldn't be nearly as useful. So one of the defining characteristics of a computer is it has to be general purpose. Large scale just means powerful. And electronic is, you know, obviously a computer has to be electronic. Mechanical computers just wouldn't make it in today's race. So that's the definition that has sort of evolved to unequivocally say ENIAC was the first. But I think you can sort of boil that down into saying ENIAC was the first modern computer.
Why did the patent become a controversy?
Well, the patent became a controversy because Sperry Rand had the patent, which they bought from Eckert and Mauchly, or Remington Rand bought, and it had come to Sperry Rand. And Sperry was #2 in computing, and IBM was #1 at this time. And there were it was IBM and the Seven Dwarfs. There were 6 other companies, Honeywell and et cetera, who were trying to build computers. So Sperry entered into a secret cross-licensing agreement with IBM, where for a very minimal fee, IBM got access to the ENIAC patent. And then Sperry went to the rest of the industry and tried to hit them with huge fees. I mean, enormous, oppressive fees. Honeywell sued them, and the case was tried in the 70s in Minnesota. The ENIAC patent was the club that gave Sperry the ability to charge these fees, and it actually hadn't been awarded until the 1960s. So this thing was going to run until, I believe, 1988 or so. I mean, this is the early 70s, a very rapid, and the computer industry is sort of in its adolescence, very time of rapid change and development. The judge found 2 reasons to invalidate the patent. One was simply that Eckert and Mauchly had been late filing it. It took them about 2 years for a host of reasons to actually file it. And the judge decided that once they had turned the machine over to the Army, it was in public use. And so from that point, they had 1 year to file it under the law, and it took them 2, and so they filed too late. And the other was he found that Mauchly had been influenced by this fellow in Iowa at Nassau. And so the idea for the original, the idea to build an electronic digital computer came from at Nassau, not from Mauchly. That's just not the case. It's, I mean, I found letters that Mauchly had written that predated his visit to Iowa, where he very clearly says he's ordering neon tubes and things from supply houses because he says, I'm going to build an electronic digital calculating machine. He didn't have the term computer then. At Nassau had been very much aware of ENIAC. Mauchly had worked for him later as a consultant. He, at Nassau, had been involved in a project for the Navy to build a computer. You know, the Army had one, so the Navy had to have one, and they turned to at Nassau. And he had never made a claim that any of this came from him until the Honeywell lawyers found him. And so, you know, my conclusion is the judge very much did the right thing for the country. And this has happened before in the automobile industry and other industries, where he opened the computer industry up to competition by invalidating the patent. And
Nobody had the patent?
Nobody had the patent. He did not award it to at Nassau. He just invalidated it. Boom, that's it. And so the industry, there are no royalties, there are no permission, there's no, it's fair game for everyone. And that was a very important thing in the computer industry, to take that club away and let everybody go off to the races. But Eckert and Mauchly were the bystanders in this drive-by shooting, the fight between Sperry and Honeywell.
Now, what did they do once they left the University of Pennsylvania? They started their own?
They started their own. They went out on their own and really struggled, built a couple different machines, had a very hard time selling them. One of the factors was there was a time when Mauchly's security clearance was pulled. It was the McCartney era, and he was suspected by the Army of being a communist sympathizer, and his wife had drowned at the Jersey Shore tragically, and the Army was suspicious that somehow Mauchly had been involved in that. Without that clearance, they couldn't get government contracts. The government was a major buyer of computers at the time. That was difficult. The crowning blow was they were building machines for, or one of their backers was a company that made tote boards for racetracks. You could use the computer to quickly add up the odds for the racetrack. The fellow who was backing them in that venture died in a plane crash. After that, the company pulled the plug on them with their funding there, and so they had to sell. Eckert ended up staying with Sperry for a long time out in Bluebell at what's now the Unisys campus. And Mauchly went out on his own. The guy, we talked about him being a dreamer. The guy was always way ahead of his time. He tried to build a portable computer and built this luggable thing. In fact, I ran into an engineer who had worked with him on it, and it was so big it had a 250-pound printer, and to carry it around, they sawed it in half, and so they put handles on it so they could carry it around. But obviously, he was too far ahead of his time. I mean, everybody carries around a portable computer, but the industry just wasn't where it should have been to have that venture be a success. Mauchly tried to sell an email system, of all things.
When was that?
And it was electronic messaging.
What year?
This was in the 70s. And people weren't online. He was too far ahead of his time. Obviously, it's been an enormous thing, but he was too far out there, and it wasn't practical.
What of that was in ENIAC, the portion of which sits before us here, is similar to the computer that sits on people's desktops now?
To me, a surprisingly large amount. The basic architecture, the basic design, we talked about this thing as being the read-only memory and all. If you looked at this machine as kind of a blueprint, it would be the fundamental structure of a computer today. Now, it didn't have the stored program memory. That came in the second machine that they designed. Interestingly, we were talking about von Neumann. That became known as the von Neumann architecture. And the von Neumann architecture is used today. It exists today. It's the basic architecture of a computer. It was Press Eckert who really developed what became known as the von Neumann architecture. Von Neumann published a paper about it, failed to credit Eckert, failed to credit anybody but von Neumann for the idea, and so it became known as the von Neumann architecture. It was a great disservice to Press Eckert, who had already figured out how to store a program electronically before von Neumann ever showed up on this campus. And so there was a neat project done a while back where it was called the computer tree, and it was all the major mainframes and all that led to the PC, and all the branches came down, and at the very bottom of the computer tree was ENIAC, and that's where it all sprang from that.
How fast did computers spread once ENIAC was made?
Well, I think to most of us fairly quickly. To Eckert and Mauchly, not nearly fast enough. And they were always railing on, why is it taking so long? Why is it so slow? Particularly Mauchly, who had all these wonderful ideas, and the computing industry just wasn't, keeping up with him. They saw it as a very logical path. Why does it take so long? But another interesting thing they saw, I mean, they were incredible visionaries in many ways. This machine was built in a university, and von Neumann and Goldstein and many others thought that computing would develop within the university environment, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, wherever, and certainly Princeton, where von Neumann was. And many of the early machines were. But Eckert and Mauchly really believed that computing development would happen much faster in the commercial world, that there you had more incentive to get new products out quickly. That's where the money was, that's where the need was. And that's one of the major reasons why they set out on their own and formed their own company, because they really thought it would happen faster there. And obviously the history of computing development has borne that out. It's the companies were way ahead of the universities.
What kind of reaction have you had to the book?
It's been great. It's been a lot of fun. As I've gone around, there have been at different events 2 groups that come together. There's been a wonderful reaction from many of the old timers who were involved in some aspect, not just of ENIAC, but of early computing, and it's great to hear their stories and all. But they're sort of it also draws an element of young kids and graduate students on down who are, who grew up on computers and are fascinated. And so to see them at different events start talking to each other about, we did this and why did you do that, and it has really been fun. The families have been very supportive. It's been, I've gotten a lot of nice feedback from letters from historians and other folks in the industry who have really been supportive of the project.
You have another book in the works?
I don't right now. Just trying to hold down my day job.
This is the cover of the book we've been talking about, ENIAC, The Triumphs and Tragedies of the World's First Computers. Scott McCartney, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.